Picture this. You've just won a massive election landslide. You're sitting in number 10 with a whopping majority. You've got the keys to the kingdom, and less than 6 months later, the boss of your party's biggest union backer is publicly declaring that you getting replaced is inevitable. Not likely, not possible, inevitable. That's not a warning shot. That's a full-blown declaration that your time is up. Sharon Graham, the Unite General Secretary, has just torn Keir Starmer apart in what might be the most brutal attack on a Labour leader from their own side in recent memory, calling him rudderless and warning that the government is sowing the seeds of its own destruction. Welcome to UK Political Insight, and today we're diving into the spectacular implosion of Labour's relationship with its union backers, because apparently winning elections is the easy part, and governing without everyone turning on you is where things get properly complicated. So let's start with Sharon Graham's absolutely devastating intervention. Writing in the Times, which is a deliberately high-profile platform choice, by the way, she doesn't pull any punches whatsoever. The country is rudderless under Starmer, the government needs to decide what it stands for and who it stands for, and if we have to ask those questions, then it's not working. That's not constructive criticism, that's not helpful feedback from a concerned ally, that's a declaration of no confidence from one of Labour's most powerful institutional supporters, and it's absolutely brutal. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Graham says that Starmer being replaced is inevitable, which is extraordinary language to use about a prime minister who's been in office for less than 6 months. Inevitable. Not if things don't improve, not unless he changes course, just straight up inevitable. She's written him off completely. But then, and this is the really crucial bit, she adds that a new Labour leader with the same policies won't cut it either. So she's not just attacking Starmer personally, she's attacking the entire ideological direction of the current Labour government. This isn't about personality or presentation or media management. This is fundamental disagreement about what Labour should stand for. Graham wants the scrapping of net zero policies and the introduction of a wealth tax. Now, both of those positions are significant departures from current government policy. Net zero is basically the cornerstone of Labour's environmental agenda. It's been a bipartisan consensus for years, and scrapping it would be an enormous U-turn that would alienate huge chunks of Labour's voter base, particularly younger voters who care deeply about climate issues. But Graham's argument is essentially that workers' jobs and living standards should come first, and if environmental policies threaten those things, they need to go. It's the classic left-wing economic populism versus progressive social policy tension that's been tearing center-left parties apart across the Western world. The wealth tax demand is equally significant. Starmer's Labour has been very careful not to promise any major tax increases that could spook markets or middle-class voters. They've positioned themselves as economically responsible, fiscally cautious, definitely not going to do anything radical with taxation. Graham is basically saying that's cowardice, that Labour needs to explicitly take from the wealthy and redistribute, and anything less is a betrayal of what the party should stand for. Again, this is fundamental ideological disagreement, not tactical quibbling. Now, let's talk about Unite specifically, because this isn't just any union leader sounding off. Unite is Labour's biggest financial backer. They provide millions in funding, organizational support, activists for campaigns, the whole infrastructure that keeps the Labour Party functioning. When your biggest donor publicly declares that your replacement is inevitable and your policies are wrong, that's not just embarrassing, it's existentially threatening. Labour cannot afford to lose Unite both financially and politically. But equally, Starmer cannot afford to look like he's being dictated to by union bosses, because that would immediately trigger every anti-Labour attack line about being in the union's pockets that the Conservatives have been using for decades. The relationship between Labour and Unite has been deteriorating pretty much since Starmer entered Downing Street. The winter fuel payment row was the first major explosion. Labour announced plans to axe winter fuel payments for most pensioners as part of fiscal tightening measures, and the backlash was immediate and fierce. Unite was furious, pensioner groups were up in arms, and Labour's poll numbers started tanking. Eventually, the government was forced into what can only be described as a humiliating U-turn, reinstating payments, but looking weak and incompetent in the process. Graham's message at the time was essentially, this is what happens when you abandon Labour values to chase fiscal credibility. You alienate your base and achieve nothing. Since then, it's just been deteriorating further. There have been reports, and these are genuinely extraordinary, that Unite could hold a historic vote on splitting from Labour entirely. Think about that for a second. Labor's biggest union backer potentially formally disaffiliating from the party. That would be absolutely seismic. It would blow a massive hole in Labor's finances, it would be a symbolic repudiation of everything Starmer represents, and it would embolden other unions and left-wing factions to challenge the leadership. This isn't just internal grumbling. This is the architecture of the labor movement potentially coming apart. Graham's critique that the government is sowing the seeds of its own destruction if it doesn't change course is particularly pointed given what's coming in May. The local elections are widely expected to be an absolute bloodbath for Labor. Governments typically do badly in midterm local elections anyway, it's sort of tradition, but Labor's position is particularly vulnerable because they haven't built up any reservoir of goodwill or achieved any obvious wins that voters can point to. The winter fuel payment fiasco damaged them with pensioners, their cautious economic approach has disappointed the left, they haven't solved any of the big public service crises they inherited, and Reform UK is eating into their vote in working class areas, while the Lib Dems and Greens are picking off urban progressives who think Labour is not ambitious enough. So when Graham talks about the government being rudderless, she's tapping into something that goes beyond just union politics. There's a genuine sense, even among people who wanted Labour to win, that Starmer doesn't really stand for anything coherent. He's not Boris Johnson, which was enough to get elected, but what is he actually for? What's the vision? What are we building toward? Graham's line about Britain leading the first industrial revolution and being nowhere in the fourth is a direct challenge to that lack of vision. Where's the ambition? Where's the plan to actually transform the country rather than just manage decline slightly more competently than the Tories did? The accusation of austerity light is particularly damaging because it was exactly the criticism made to Ed Miliband's Labour, and we all remember how that turned out. The left has always argued that Labour loses when it tries to be Tory light on economics, that voters will always prefer the real thing to the imitation. Graham is essentially saying Starmer is making the same mistake, pursuing cautious economic restraint and means-tested policies instead of bold redistribution and universal programs, and it's going to end the same way, in electoral disaster and internal recrimination. Now, Starmer's defenders would argue, and they have a point, that governing is choices and constraints. You can't just promise to spend unlimited money you don't have. Markets react, borrowing costs increase, and suddenly your grand vision crashes into economic reality. They'd say that Graham's proposals, scrapping net zero and introducing a wealth tax, are electorally toxic. The first would alienate progressive voters and make Britain an international pariah on climate. The second would trigger capital flight and economic panic. They'd argue that Starmer is doing what's necessary, what's responsible, even if it's not what activists want to hear. But here's the problem with that defense. If you're going to pursue cautious, centrist, fiscally responsible policies, you need to be really good at delivery and communication. You need to show tangible improvements in people's lives quickly. You need to tell a compelling story about why these difficult choices are necessary and what they're building toward. Starmer's Labour has failed spectacularly at all of that. The messaging is muddled, the delivery has been chaotic, and there's no compelling narrative. So you end up with the worst of both worlds. You're disappointing your base with cautious policies, but you're not even getting credit for competence because the execution is so poor. The doom loop Graham references is real. Labour's poll numbers are declining, which makes the government more nervous, which makes them more cautious, which disappoints more people, which drives the polls down further. And with local elections looming in May that could be genuinely catastrophic, the pressure is only going to increase. If Labour loses hundreds of council seats, and current projections suggest they will, the knives will really come out, not just from union leaders, but from MPs, party members, and the media. The inevitable conversations about leadership will become deafening. Graham's intervention is particularly significant because she's not some fringe left-wing activist. She's the leader of Britain's second largest trade union with over 1 million members. She represents a huge chunk of Labour's traditional base, working-class people in industrial and service jobs that Labour is supposed to champion. When she says the government doesn't know who it stands for, she's speaking for a lot of people who feel abandoned by a party that's supposed to represent their interests. The suggestion that a new leader with the same agenda won't cut it is also strategically important. It's not personal, it's political. Graham isn't saying replace Starmer with someone more charismatic and everything will be fine. She's saying the entire Starmerite project is fundamentally flawed and cosmetic changes won't fix it. That's a much deeper challenge to Labour's current direction, and it's one that won't go away even if Starmer somehow survives. There's also a class dimension here that's worth exploring. Starmer represents a certain type of labor politics: professional, metropolitan, focused on institutional credibility and media management. Graham represents old labor, rooted in trade unions, working-class communities, and economic redistribution. These two visions of what the party should be have been in tension for decades, and Starmer's attempt to bridge them by being economically cautious while maintaining progressive social positions hasn't worked. He's ended up satisfying nobody, and Graham's attack crystallizes that failure. The comparison Graham makes to industrial revolutions is particularly cutting. Britain did lead the first industrial revolution. We were the workshop of the world. We invented modernity. And now, we're nowhere in the fourth industrial revolution of AI, green technology, and digital transformation. We're watching America and China race ahead while we argue about whether we can afford to properly fund the NHS. That lack of ambition, that acceptance of managed decline, is what Graham is really attacking. She's saying labor should be about building something better, not just tweaking around the edges of a broken system. And she's probably right that if the government doesn't change course, it is sowing the seeds of its own destruction. History is littered with governments that won big majorities and then squandered them through timidity and lack of vision. Labor has a massive opportunity right now to actually transform Britain after 14 years of Tory chaos. But if they waste that opportunity being cautious and disappointing their own supporters, the voters will punish them brutally.